Welcome to everybody. We are so pleased to have you here tonight. We know it's Valentine's Day, but thank you for attending. Welcome, and my name is Eileen Hoffmarch. I'm speaking from Appleton, Wisconsin. Tonight's webinar, Speak Up for Lake Superior's Bad River Watershed, is sponsored by First Congregational United Church of Christ, Appleton, Wisconsin, through the work of its Indigenous Peoples Allies Committee. This webinar is supported by a Kairos Catalyst grant from the Creation Care Collaborative team at the Wisconsin UCC Conference. Grant-funded efforts are focused on environmental issues through education, advocacy, and calls to action. Before beginning this evening's presentation, a little bit of information about the format of this webinar. Our wonderful tech specialists, Steve Herbie and Ken Yankee, are at the controls. They have muted all attendees and turned off their cameras for the duration of the program. Only panelists will be seen and heard. You probably have already noticed the chat function has also been disabled during the presentations and enabled during Q&A. Q&A will be open throughout this hour. Please feel free to type your questions in Q&A anytime during the presentations. After both presentations, our panelists will answer questions posted in the Q&A as they are able. You should also know there is a live transcript button at the bottom of the screen should you wish to use it. And we really thank you for attending this evening. Now it's my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our two panelists. We have a change in tonight's speakers. Our first panelist, Jillian Buckart, was unable to join us this evening. Marcia Bjornerud will speak instead. She is a professor of geosciences and environmental studies at Lawrence University in Appleton. A structural geologist, she has done field research in Arctic and mainland Norway, Arctic Canada, Scotland, New Zealand, Italy, and the Lake Superior region, including the Gogebic Range and the Pinocchi Hills. She has worked on a pro bono basis with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission in challenging two mining projects in the Lake Superior watershed. In 2008, she was an expert witness in an administrative court case against the Eagle Copper Nickel Sulfide Mine northwest of Marquette, Michigan. In 2012, she prepared a report for GLIFWC on the potential environmental effects of a proposed mountaintop removal ironing mining project in the Gogebic Range and testified about this at a hearing at the Wisconsin State Capitol. And she also is a mother of three sons, an avid cross-country skier, and a wild food forager, and once bicycled around Lake Superior with two friends. It took 13 days. So welcome, Marcia.
Thank you so much, Eileen, and to everyone who's here on Valentine's Day. So as Eileen said, I'm a geologist, and I'm going to give my perspective on the draft environmental impact statement about the Line 5 changes and give you some ideas about how you can most effectively submit comments during this public comment period. So I'm going to share my screen. And let me say first that these pipelines and things like environmental impact statements are what French philosopher Bruno Latour would call hyper objects. They're big, complex hydras with many heads. They're things that are very difficult to wrap our arms and our minds around because they have so many components: economic, social, cultural, environmental. They often have deep historical entanglements as well. So this is a very complex issue. And in a short 30-minute presentation or less, there's no way I can cover everything. So I've elected to focus on a few components of the environmental impact statement where I think there's the most potential for leverage. So if you haven't looked at the draft environmental impact statement, it's available at this website. It's pretty easy. If you just Google EIS line 5 Wisconsin, you'll get to the page on the DNR site, and I can show that to you later, where the environmental impact statement, a whole bunch of appendices, a lot of correspondence, and also public comments that have already been posted are all available at one site. The environmental impact statement itself is 330 pages long, and as I said, has at least 15 appendices. So it's a monstrous document. It's broken into the chapters that you can see on the screen here at right. Particularly useful if you've never looked at a document like this would be the first chapter, where it kind of lays out what an environmental impact statement is and how it fits into the larger regulatory process, both in Wisconsin and with respect to federal level legislation, including the Clean Water Act and other federal law. My view of this statement is that it's basically a good faith effort by DNR personnel. There are at least 12.5 DNR people involved that include biologists, hydrogeologists, archaeologists, economists, and others, as well as people that were hired from a consulting firm called TRC based in Madison, that is a reputable environmental consulting firm and engineering consulting firm. And so the document itself is, they've done essentially what they should be doing in an environmental impact statement, but I think where it falls short are in the areas that I've highlighted in yellow. They give some coverage to some alternatives and some coverage at the very end of really larger systemic alternatives for us. So rather than going too far into the weeds in this 330-page document about whether particular designs for pipes are appropriate or not, given certain types of soils or bedrock in different areas, I think let's zoom out and really talk about the big picture and help, I hope, give you some context for letters you might be writing. So let's look at the sort of continental scale picture of these pipelines run by this company, Enbridge. You can see they're kind of a spider web across the country. And line 5 in particular is connected via some of the other pipelines to the tar sands, especially up in Alberta. And I imagine most people have heard of these. This is probably one of the worst ways of obtaining fossil fuels, which are problematic in any case, but tar sands are one of the most environmentally destructive sources of fossil fuels. It's not really liquid petroleum, but it's tarry, highly viscous hydrocarbons that are locked up in rocks. It's very energy intensive to, in fact, extract that kind of petroleum. And then it's environmentally destructive because you're essentially strip mining huge areas. You're not just drilling, you're actually mining the rock and processing the rock. So the tar sands are just a bad thing. And that to me is one of the key points, that this pipeline is a Canadian company mining a very non-sustainable resource and asking us to transport it across US territory to their processing facilities in Southern Ontario. So it is true, and they will argue this in every moment they can, that pipelines are the safest way to transport oil and gas. They have truly a lower climate footprint than transporting oil and gas with trucks or even rail. But that's not really the point. We should not be in the business of underwriting cheap fossil fuels in a time when we're concerned about climate change, and particularly not oil and gas that are being obtained in this way from tar sands. So to me, that's kind of the biggest level objection. It's more than just line 5. We shouldn't be making this possible. And if you look, I've tried to indicate where in the environmental impact statement, if you are interested in going in and really finding some of the things that I'm going to be highlighting. I've already I've always tried to be careful about where I found them. And it's a little bit confusing when you download the PDF. The page numbers that are indicated in the table of contents aren't quite the same page numbers that show up in the PDF, just because there are some prefatory pages that have a different Roman numeral numbering scheme. So this is page 5 of the actual document, but on the PDF version, it's page 35. But here is where we see what line 5 is primarily being used for. Transport of the tar sands from northern Alberta, to some extent the shale oil of the Bakken Formation in North Dakota, Montana, and Saskatchewan again. And this is fracking, so I'm sure people are aware of hydrofracturing. This is maybe not as terrible as tar sands, but has all kinds of other problems. But again, this is largely Canadian oil and gas that's being transported through these pipelines, primarily to Sarnia, Ontario. And interestingly, late in the document, they do show some alternative routes, or I guess midway through the document, that were considered and rejected by Enbridge. One of these is shown here as this northern route. This does not exist, but it was, thrown out there as a potential alternative and then discarded because it would be way too expensive and it would be environmentally damaging because you'd be building a very long pipeline. But it's really interesting that if it had to go through Canada, it would stay well clear of the Lake Superior and Lake Huron basins. I presume that's because Canada has much more stringent environmental rules than the United States. But Enbridge is perfectly fine with routing the existing Line 5, not only extremely close to Lake Superior, but indeed underneath the Straits of Mackinac that are the junction between Lakes Michigan and Huron. And this is another very problematic part of Line 5. I'll mention it a little bit at the end. So again, zooming way out, a big issue is that we are subsidizing this largely Canadian project, and we are bearing all the risk and have really very little benefit, especially in Wisconsin. If that weren't enough, of course, the Indigenous people have borne most of that risk over time. This is a really great map. I got it from the GLFWC, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission website. And it's showing how many of these pipelines are almost preferentially going through native territory, either reservation lands or especially through the ceded territories that Philomena might tell us more about, where the tribes of the Great Lakes have in treaty protection the rights for hunting and fishing in perpetuity. So again, these people living in these areas are bearing all the risk of potential pipeline failures, but really none of the benefits. And there's really an excellent student story map. I don't know if people are familiar with that concept of a story map using GIS, or Geographic Information System imagery, that kind of walks you through this. It's not a coincidence, but the geographic coincidence of the pipelines and the ceded territories. So I'm not sure if we can make these links available easily to people later. I'd be happy to do that in some way, maybe via email. But this really tells this story of social and environmental injustice. So the proposal that is before us is happening because the Bad River Band of Lake Superior Chippewa has stood up and said, we no longer want this pipeline running right through our reservation. And that has been the case since 1953, when the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which especially in the past was largely white patriarchal administrators, gave permission for this pipeline to run right through the reservation, right across the lower part of the Bad River. So the tribe in 2017 began to make the legal case that they did not want the pipeline running through their land anymore, and they have won that legal case. So that is why Enbridge is proposing this blue line would be the cheapest, shortest way around the boundaries of the reservation And this is their primary proposal, this blue line. It's about 41 miles long. And it would be the same caliber as the existing pipeline, which is something like 30-inch pipeline. By federal regulations, it needs to be buried to at least something like 8 inches everywhere, deeper if possible. They do have 2 other potential lines, and I'll talk about each of these 3 scenarios very briefly. I just want to, if you haven't been in this area, here's Ashland, here's Copper Falls State Park, and adjacent state natural areas. And then, of course, this is the Bad River Reservation, and the Bad River flows through the reservation out into this amazing area called the Kakagan Sloughs that I'll mention, and I would imagine Philomena will mention as well. Oops, sorry. So this is a watershed look at this area. Copper Falls State Park is a remarkable area where several rivers flow together. The Tyler Forks and the Bad River come together in a series of waterfalls over beautiful bedrock exposures, and then kind of flattens out into the lower Bad River watershed, and then, as I said, flows into Lake Superior at the sloughs. As Eileen mentioned, I worked a little bit with Glyphwick several times in the last 10 or 12 years on mining projects or challenging mining, proposed mining projects. And after the Gogebic taconite work, Mike Wiggins, who is the chair of the Bad River Band, invited one of my sons and me out to the Kakagan Sloughs, and it was a life-changing experience for me. I had no idea that this ecosystem existed in Wisconsin. It's like the Everglades, the Northern Everglades. It's not quite land, it's not quite water. And it was, yeah, a dreamscape. It hosts the last extensive stand of wild rice in Lake Superior. And, you know, by any metric, it's on par with World Heritage sites of the UN around the world. We should not be doing anything that puts this area at risk. So the first proposal, that blue line on the map, is just audacious in its awfulness. It passes within 2 miles. In fact, it passes between Copper Falls State Park and the adjacent state natural area to the north, within 2 miles of the state park boundaries, and basically through, just barely skirting the edge of one of the state natural areas. It crosses the North Country Scenic Trail, which is a national trail like the Appalachian Trail, in 3 places. And more, the northern part of the state is reliant on tourism, both winter and summer. This is really the lifeblood of that region. During the construction phase, there is going to be a lot of noise and dust and heavy equipment blocking the narrow roads. It'll be unpleasant. And of course, the whole tourist economy could be devastated if there were pipeline failures in the upper reaches of the Bad River watershed. It's just a colossally terrible place to think about having any kind of spill of fossil fuels. Many of the comments, if you go to the DNR website that I mentioned, and I'll show you at the end, many of the public comments so far have come from various unions saying there'll be good jobs created by this 41-mile pipeline. That may be true for a very short time. None of those jobs will be permanent once the pipeline would be constructed. Those are not life-sustaining jobs. On the contrary, again, if there were any failure, people who live there would suffer economically. So again, I think for me, and I haven't yet drafted my letter to the DNR, but I'm going to do it soon. I would keep coming back to this question: why are we allowing this pipeline on our land? There's no benefit to us. So back to our map. Let's now look at this alternative. It's a longer pipeline, which it does go further south and further away from Copper Falls State Park. Environmentally, you know, the longer the line, the more areas you're going to have to dig up. So that's really not great. I guess it's a little bit better than basically cutting through a state natural area. Again, this is the park, and then there are some state natural areas that are basically contiguous with the park. So this orange line cuts a little bit further upriver, but it starts getting into this area where bedrock is exposed, as I mentioned before. So the lower Bad River watershed has pretty thick old Lake Superior clay deposits. So that's the green area. Not that this would be a great place for the pipeline. This is where it is now. It would potentially contaminate the surface water, but the groundwater, at least in this area, is not as susceptible. But a pipeline leak, and again, a buried pipeline leak up in this area could contaminate groundwater pretty quickly. There's very, very thin cover. You basically just have fractured bedrock. So putting the pipeline further upstream is really not much better. It's a longer pipeline, and in some ways it's kind of a straw man alternative, I think. Oops. So then they've also got this third possibility, which is a very long pipeline, which is not great because, again, there's more digging and there's more potential areas of leaking, but at least this one does go outside the Bad River watershed for most of its length. So here's the Bad River watershed. The first and second proposals are all within that, both basically in the headwaters area. So if you contaminate the headwaters, you contaminate the entire river. The third proposal kind of loops around here. Again, it's not great because it's just such a long pipeline. So there isn't any single simple answer to this other than starting to think about decommissioning Line 5 completely. And I've been thinking about this, and I think that the reading between the lines in the environmental impact statement, I feel like the DNR has left the door open for people to say this in several places in those alternate scenario chapters that I highlighted at the beginning. Only a small number of people in northern Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan apparently are actually served by the natural gas products that come out of the pipeline. There is a processing plant near Escanaba that's called the Rapid River Processing Plant. It produces propane, which does supply propane to a large area of the UP in northern Wisconsin. But that propane is not being tracked back through the pipeline to these people. I can't imagine that that's the case. So that is the only little benefit that people in northern Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan are getting from the existence of Line 5. To me, that is not compelling reason that we should put our waters at risk for, again, a Canadian company that's transporting Canadian product to a Canadian refinery. And on the very last page of the environmental impact statement, I found this really interesting. The DNR has chosen to have these 3 paragraphs highlighting the fact that the state of Michigan 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, decided, like the Bad River tribe, to cease its easement with Enbridge for Line 5 beneath the Straits of Mackinac, which is, again, here where Lakes Michigan and Huron come together. This is really a weak link in the pipeline. If it failed here, and there's scuba divers who have been doing imagery of it, it's in very bad shape. This would be cataclysmic for these 2 lakes. So the state of Michigan, in spite of the fact that Enbridge is arguing that people in the UP absolutely need this pipeline, the state of Michigan itself says we don't want that pipeline going through our lakes. So they have taken this to court. And of course, Enbridge was not happy at all. Michigan initially tried to do this in its state courts and said that it had jurisdiction. Enbridge then filed a countersuit, and it does not say this in the environmental impact statement, but I've looked it up. Unfortunately, the state of Michigan lost the initial countersuit again that Enbridge filed, and this will be going to federal court. and it's pending as far as I know. But this is interesting to me that on the last page of our environmental impact statement, the DNR has chosen to sort of show people that it is possible for this entire thing potentially to be decommissioned. So now let me just end by giving you some advice about how I think you can be most effective if you're going to submit a letter during this public comment period. And first of all, this is a screenshot of the DNR site that I mentioned. They have extended the public comment period for 2 weeks. Initially, it was March 4th. Now it's March 18th. So we all have a little bit more time to craft these letters and submit them. And I strongly urge you to do that. They don't need to be long, but I think the more voices, the better. So my advice, having been involved in some of these issues before and kind of seeing different public views being expressed, is first of all, explain why you should be taken seriously. Why are you a stakeholder? And there can be different reasons. It can be emotional, connection to land. It could be economic. It could be whatever. But explain who you are and why you're taking action. I think it's important to acknowledge that this is not an easy problem, and even potentially say you acknowledge the work that the DNR has done in preparing this environmental impact statement rather than just attacking it. Then I would say choose 1 or 2 key talking points. And in my last 2 slides, I'll kind of summarize what I've said. But of course, you may have others. I think having a couple of points clearly made is more effective than a very long letter. Try to be calm. I'm not feeling very calm just talking about this, but I think our letters should come across as being reasoned and rational, even if the issue isn't. Cite particular pages in the environmental impact statement if you've read it or if you've scanned it, to again show that you're an informed citizen and you're not just reacting without information. And then sadly, I think if you can, economic arguments often carry more weight, or they're easier to quantify anyway. As I said, if you look at the public comments that are already posted, most of them are economic arguments about jobs and how the local economy would be helped during the construction phase. So if we can push back against some of those, our case will be made stronger. Also, you should know that your letters will be posted. This is part of the whole Freedom of Information Act and the transparency. Your personal contact information will be deleted or blacked out, but your name and your city of residence will be part of the public record. So if you're not comfortable with that, then you shouldn't submit a letter. So my key talking points, and these are things that I've already talked about in this talk, would be that, first of all, we shouldn't be subsidizing cheap fossil fuels in a time when climate change is becoming a more and more urgent issue, and particularly not the tar sands. They're the worst. It's not even an efficient way of getting fossil fuels. Again, this is a Canadian company asking us to take their dirty product across US territory to a Canadian processing plant. Why? And they wouldn't even do it in their own territory as close to the Great Lakes as they're asking us to do it. It's a classic case of privatizing the profits and socializing the risks. And this, in this case, not even for an American company. And that fact that Enbridge couldn't build the pipeline in Canada as close to the Great Lakes, to me, is just kind of an acknowledgement that it's willing to take advantage of our much laxer environmental standards. They're willing to take risks with Wisconsin water, but not Ontario water, apparently. Again, these pipelines, especially Line 5, preferentially cut through native lands and the ceded territories where the tribes have every right to say, no, we have right to clean water and land in these areas, and people in this area are not getting the benefits. proposed line will cut through state park, state natural areas close to the Ice Age and North Country Trail, and the tourist economy is at risk. Very few jobs will be created, none permanent. So again, why? Why are we underwriting this project? So let me just quickly show you, and then I will finish the website, which is easy to find. Again, just one moment here. Share that screen. I'm hoping everyone is seeing the actual live website. So this is the one, if you just Google environmental impact statement, line 5, Wisconsin, you'll find this quite easily. Otherwise, you can see the address up there. Here's where it states that comments need to be submitted by March 18th. And here's the website. So it's easy to find. The environmental impact statement, the 330-page document, is downloadable there. It's a PDF file. And then you can see more documents. There's been a lot of back and forth with different organizations and agencies. All of the appendices are here. There has been a bit of back and forth with different groups, including the city of Ashland, Gliffwick, et cetera. Also with Enbridge. So Enbridge has had to submit supplementary data to DNR over a period of a year or so. So there's all of this stuff. And then if you keep scrolling down, then you get to the public review part. You can see what the Bad River Band and the Red Cliff Band and Gliffwick have said about the draft environmental impact statement. So if you want to look at their letters, you can kind of chime with things that they're saying. They too are arguing that we need to think more broadly about alternatives. And then you start seeing, this is where you can look at what people have submitted. I'll just click on one of these. Lots of people have filled in postcards and sent them in. So you can see here people who are not actually writing their own letters, but they're from, I don't know what these people are representing, but you can see their name and where they're from. So lots of people have taken kind of mass action, especially some of the unions that are arguing there'd be lots of jobs created. So we need equal numbers of voices arguing the same way. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Marcia. That was very enlightening. Now we will be hearing from our second panelist, who is Philomena Quebec. Philomena belongs to the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. She moved home 10 years ago to advocate for protection of watershed resources. Philomena is an elected Ashland County supervisor. She also runs a small nonprofit, Bad River Harm Reduction, that provides services to prevent overdoses and infection for people who use drugs. This nonprofit welcomes financial support, so please do check out their website. Philomena is deeply knowledgeable about the Bad River watershed and its residents, and we're so pleased to have her with us this evening. Welcome, Philomena.
I'm gonna unmute myself. Hi, everyone. So I'm Philomena Quebec. One thing that I didn't put on my introduction is that I spent 10 years as an attorney working for the Bad River, or I'm sorry, 10 collective years, but 3 years working for the Bad River tribe as an attorney. And this was during our Pinocchio Hills battle that we had to endure in order to save our groundwater from a very destructive taconite mining operation. And then I worked 7 years as a policy analyst at Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. And much of that was spent focused on the affirming our treaty rights and really implementing those treaty rights. What are those treaty rights, So I very much appreciate Marcia's introduction and, discussion tonight. She did a really good job of hitting all those high points. What I want to do is tell some stories. And I feel like that is part of our issue in Bad River is certainly any impacts on our hunting, our fishing rights, but it's much more than that. This project threatens our very existence, and I think it is worth talking about how we came to be where we are, and why our reservation is within the Bad River watershed. So, there's a very long story about how our people came to this area. I'm not going to go into that, but in the 1850s or so, the 1840s, 1830s, there was a president in the United States called Andrew Jackson, and he wanted to get rid of all the Indians, move them east or west of the Mississippi River. And so there were these initiatives that were taken to move the Cherokee Nation and the Choctaws and the Seminoles to Oklahoma Territory. And but they weren't satisfied with that. They wanted to move all the Indians west of the Mississippi River. It was a really terrifying time because by the 1800s, the United States, this new nation, had become quite wealthy because it prospered from the labor of enslaved people. And this nation enslaved millions of Africans and use their labor in order to create this cotton, this cotton-based economy. And because of that, the nation was hungry for more land and was not afraid to use violence in order to accomplish its goals. Up until the 1800s, there had been a much different balance of power between certainly the Ojibwe Nation and the Americans. The Ojibways were in control of the Mississippi trade routes because of our control at the Straits of Mackinac. Our people were incredible at navigation and canoeing, boating within that straits area, which is very dangerous. So things changed economically, though, as the United States became more wealthy. Our people signed a series of treaties with the United States. The Treaty of 18. There were quite a few treaties that were signed. The Treaty of Prairie du Chien, I believe that was in 1824. And then later treaties that actually ceded land. So we allowed the United States to come onto our jurisdiction in 1836, 1837, and 1842. And I'll just share a screen so that you can see the map of what I'm talking about. Boop, boop. All right. So, oh, Glyphwick map, you're not helping me out. There's a map here. Sorry about this. I should have been more prepared. This is Chief Buffalo. I'm going to be talking about this delegation in a minute. Here's a Glyphwick meeting. And then, oh, fisher trapping. Darn it. It'll circuit. I think it's the next one. Oh, there's Ron. Oh, and some wild rice parching. these are some of the activities that we do as Anishinaabeg. And there's there's spring spearfishing. Darn it. Sorry about this, guys. Oh, and there's Wesley. There's the map. Okay, so these are our various treaty areas. So the Ojibwe Nation, you know, and that's not even all of our treaty areas. As Ojibwe people, we controlled a lot of the Western Great Lakes region. And but you know, we had to enter into these treaties with the United States because we felt like it was more strategic to negotiate with this rising power than to go to war. And in the 1848, the president at that time and the War Department were really pressured into moving our annuity payment. So that was a payment that came after we signed the treaties to the Sandy Lake area. And there was a lot of things that went wrong with this. We had hundreds of families, thousands of people gathered at Sandy Lake in the fall in order to collect the annuity payment, and the annuity payment never came. And when some provisions did come, they were moldy, and there were barely anything was provided to the families. So we had a mass starvation event where hundreds of people died, hundreds of Ojibwe people died for really no reason, except you had unethical traders who wanted to move our people into Minnesota in order to profit from our presence there. So at that point, you know, the Ojibways in what's now Wisconsin, go in the other room if you're going to talk, got together, and our leader, Chief Buffalo, was about 92 years old at this time. And the people wanted to sign a new treaty with the United States that would give us a guarantee that we would be able to stay within our homeland. Our people have lived within, you know, the Bad River area, Madeline Island, for hundreds of years now, and this is our home. We fought for this land. We, you know, we have this very deep connected relationship to this land. Our whole culture is based around the foods that we collect and the places that we, you know, where we live. So Chief Buffalo and the headmen decided that in order to accomplish this directive by the communities, by the tribes, that they would go to Washington, D.C. And so they went to Washington, D.C. in a caravan, several canoes. And along the way, while they were going, they collected letters of support from the various non-native communities that they lived with and that were, you know, part of the overall regional network. Okay, buddy, I'm talking to some people now, okay? So they canoed as far as they went, and then they walked and they took the train. They got to Washington, D.C. They knocked on the door to try and get a meeting with the president, and they were turned away. They were turned away by the War Department, which was in charge of Indian Affairs, because they hadn't received permission to go on this trip. They needed permission in order to talk to the president. And so, you know, they ended up at this coffee shop and or this cafe, and they were pretty forlorn because they had gone all this way and they had a very important thing to do. And so while they were there, there was a senator who wanted to know who they were and started engaging with them and talking to them. And this senator, after hearing about their story and learning what had happened, including all the tragic losses and the letters of support they had received and the way that they had traveled, the senator said, I am in the same party as the president and I will get you an audience with him. So they stayed in DC, they got an audience with the president, they talked to the president, and they were able to share their concerns and what had happened. And based on their concerns, the president agreed to engage in another treaty making session with our people, with the Lake Superior Chippewa, in order to develop a promise from the United States that we would have a permanent homeland within our territories. And so that bared fruit. And in 1854, on September 30th, 1854, the treaty negotiation was finalized, and it provided for 9 permanent reservations within the Lake Superior Basin, including the Bad River Reservation, which is located within the Bad River Watershed. What's really important to understand about the Bad River Watershed, and I'm gonna show you a map that my former colleague Esteban created. So hold on just a second. Let me bring that up. To do share screen. And so as you can see, this is kind of a small graphic to show your reservation. This is our reservation here. This is the present articulation of line 5. And it bisects the reservation. And if you can see, I'm sorry, this is very small print, but as you can see, there's a number of rivers that are located, that flow onto the reservation. Our reservation is like a bowl, and we have like more than 100 river bodies that end up flowing through the reservation onto our lands, and then either going to Lake Superior through the Bad River. There's a couple different rivers that they flow into Lake Superior from. But everything surrounding our reservation boundaries ends up going through our reservation and into Lake Superior. So it's a little bit unusual. We have river systems that run north, not south. So this is a separate and discrete river system than the Mississippi River. And because we have there's a pretty high altitude up here south of the reservation as compared to the where Lake Superior is, we call it flashy and it's fast. And so it not only does it go through the reservation, but it doesn't take a whole lot of time. Our rivers are really fast, and those are some of the considerations that make it very dangerous. When I gave some comments to the DNR with respect to the draft EIS, and my comments were focused on the treaty right, our treaty right to have our reservation and to enjoy a reservation, and our right to exist. And those things are together. This, that area that I showed you, our reservation, our Bad River Reservation, is the only place in the whole world, where we can be Bad River people, where our government can be located, where we can provide housing to our people, where we can provide health services. And, our not only did the federal government guarantee that we would have that homeland in perpetuity and that we should never, ever be removed from our homeland, but that there have been billions of dollars of investment into all the infrastructure that is located in Bad River, the roads, the sewer system, the plumbing, the all the governmental buildings, all the public housing buildings. We have at least 150, I think about 150 HUD homes that are located within Bad River that provide for public housing opportunities for our tribal members. We also have all the hunting and fishing opportunities that occur within the reservation, and our reservation extends out into the waters of Lake Superior. And so everything that's within our reservation, we have jobs programs. That's what I'm doing right now as a tribal employee. I'm working on economic development and all of these, all these improvements that have been made throughout the duration of our reservation, including moving Old Odana all the way to a new location. We had our whole, our whole city center moved within the last 100 years because of the risk of flooding and because of the real flashiness of our rivers. All of that is at risk right now with the Enbridge pipeline operating, and it would be put at risk if the proposed route is approved. This is our whole country. It would be like if the whole United States was encircled by a very problematic oil project or nuclear reactors or something like that. This is our whole country, and there is no other land that we could be moved on, and to move us away from the to put our lands at risk for a foreign oil company's benefit when our people are receiving no real benefit from this project whatsoever is it's very hard to imagine how this could be. So I suppose I'm talking about the environmental justice aspects of this. I spent I spent some time working as a human rights attorney before I came to the tribe. But this is a particularly dangerous project because of the way that the hydrology works, how the surface water and we believe probably the groundwater works as well. The fact that the substances being transported are incredibly toxic and very difficult to clean up, and the fact that we were promised that we would always have a home, and with that becomes the promise that we would always have clean water and the ability to live in our place. So I think I've talked enough. I've talked for my 25 minutes. Really happy to answer any questions or have further conversation with people if you want to go further into these topics. So I'll stop now.
Philomena, thank you so much for your informative, passionate, and insightful words for us that you shared with us tonight. Before I turn to the Q&A, would you just, once before you talked about gathering in the highlands of the Bad River up around the line and the change in the ecosystem where the line currently exists. Could you speak to that a minute?
Yeah, there's a lot of, I spend a lot of time on the pipelines because I have a very close relationship with the Barrens area, which is the national forest area that's north of Ino, Wisconsin.
Right.
My family has been, that's an area that's very abundant in blueberries. My family has been picking berries there for at least the past 4 generations. And if you go on the pipelines in the Barrens area, what you'll notice is there's a lot more invasive species within these areas. And the the whole the pipeline areas are very visible. It's also there's a power line that runs through it, and there's quite a bit of traffic that comes on and off. The invasive species are really difficult. They cannot be avoided with a project like this, because there is permanent disturbance, and then in order to maintain those pipeline corridors, they're either bringing in equipment to mow, or else they're using chemical treatments to maintain areas where there's no tree cover. And it's a problem in the Barrens area, which is pretty dry. When you go into the Bad River on the Bad River Reservation, basically the whole area of the easement is river bottoms. And since the pipeline has been in place, the pipeline has changed the river morphology. And there's an area where one of the most dangerous parts of this pipeline in our estimation is this area where the pipeline crosses at the Bad River, and the river itself is trying to create an oxbow. It wants to push through this place where it had made this turn. There's a turn in the river. The pipeline is there, and it's been there since 1953. And instead of being able to do what the river does, do what rivers do over time, younger rivers straighten out, and they kind of bash through these turny areas. And because the pipeline is there, the river hasn't been able to complete that cycle. And it's a pretty dangerous spot, because come springtime, when we have high waters, and if the river does go through that area, that meander area, it could create it could bottom out the land that is supporting the pipeline, putting it at risk for breakage. And and then we're talking about a very short distance between that pipeline easement and Odana, which is where our people live, and then Lake Superior, where that it feeds all the water, and we have all the different wildlife species. These pipeline spills are impossible to clean up and really rectify, like bring the natural back. I mean, sometimes you can pick up a lot of the oil, but what you end up having to do with a situation like that is completely re-engineer the river. I've been out on the river. I've fasted on the river. I have prayed there, and all of it's an incredible place, because there's all these different animals that consider that place their home, and it is their. It's like a nature preserve, but it's not a nature preserve, because we don't do nature preserves. They have, because we haven't built it up, and we've kept things wild. It is a place where all this magic occurs. We have like wolf packs and bobcats and beavers, and you go out there and you're quiet, and you will see the most amazing stuff. And if a company were to come and destroy it with toxicity, and then have to come in and engineer a cleanup, that magic would be cleaned up too. Sure. That magic would be spoiled, and that the quality of life for our people, and then all of our more than human people that depend on that, on those river bottoms, would be forever compromised.
Of course. Thank you for that. A question has come in, I think, to Marcia. As a geologist, can you speak about potential impacts from the proposed blasting of bedrock?
Yeah, so there would have to be some areas, and again, I haven't read every page of the environmental impact statement, but there are places where bedrock is exposed at the surface, and there they would need to bury it and therefore do some kind of probable blasting. It's never a good thing. Dust, noise, general disturbance to whatever ecosystems are there. There is also, I don't know exactly where in the geologic map some of this would be done, but they're in the whole GTAC controversy that Philomena was talking about with the company that wanted to basically take the top off the Gogebic range. It was shown that there is asbestos form minerals in some of the rocks. So it's just a bad thing. And let me just, I was looking at some of the questions. Several people commented, and you're quite right. The proposed line is the orange line on the map. And the blue and the orange both are totally within the Bad River watershed. So I misspoke there. That is correct.
We have a question, says many corporations and politicians like to say the world needs this fossil fuel resource to meet the energy demand. This person says, I am a petroleum engineer and completely disagree. Can you comment on energy supply and what this project would or would not contribute? And they say, thank you both for your amazing work.
Philomena,
Marcia
do you
or
want to?
Philomena?
I don't, I think Marcia covered it with respect to, you know, her, I think a lot of us have made it clear that none of the products coming off of line 5 are really used by this community at all, and this region at all. My understanding is that, you know, whatever product is refined in Sarnia is used in the Canadian markets. And so but I believe that Marcia did the, I think there was an economics analysis that was conducted by another by a nonprofit out of Michigan that really explored this in depth. And I can try to dig that up and stick it in the chat if you want to take the next couple questions.
Okay, and I would just add that instead of sinking more and more money into what I would say is a 20th century, 19th century energy source, let's invest in renewable energy instead of locking ourselves deeper and deeper with infrastructure. So thank you to the person who asked that question. We have alternative energy sources. We should be investing in those to the greatest extent we can, and not investing in fossil fuels, which is an outmoded technology at this point.
Kind of two questions that kind of mesh here. I'd like to know more about what would happen if line 5 were decommissioned. Is there a plan? Doving in with that, do we have any evidence that can be argued about jobs that would be created by dismantling and decommissioning the pipelines in Wisconsin? They say I live with folks who'd like to play the devil's advocate and want a way to explain to them so I can get them on board.
The second question is interesting, and I saw it in the chat, and I looked up a little bit in the EIS. They have some text about the decommissioning process, and it is fairly elaborate, and also the scenario of not removing the pipeline, which is not a good idea. So there would be some jobs, and it would be fascinating to know constructing versus deconstructing how many people would actually be involved, and that's not in the EIS. That would be a wonderful counter argument that there'll be jobs created through the decommissioning process. There is a 2-sentence paragraph in the document where they talk about alternate scenarios that say line 5 could be decommissioned, but they don't really go any further than that. But again, to me, it was really interesting, the choice that was made, that the very last page of this document kind of holds the door open to Wisconsin to say, Michigan is trying to do this.
Well, we know that the Attorney General of Michigan is pursuing the governor's stance in stopping the dual pipeline under the straits before she blows. There's a final question in here. Well, no, it's not final. Marcia, proposed blasting is at Bad River just outside Copper Falls. What does that blasting through black granite imply, and how does this raise the risk to the aquifer?
Yeah, actually the Mellon area geology is quite complicated. You do have some of that black granite, and then just nearby the iron formations that I mentioned that have in places asbestiform minerals. The aquifer there is basically a fractured bedrock aquifer that has almost no glacial deposits on top, so easily contaminated. And blasting could potentially, make it even, at least in the surface area, even a little bit more permeable.
This is sort of open to both of you. It's the question is, who in Wisconsin is getting money from this project?
Just an update. I put into chat the London economics analysis of the sort of the line 5 propane issue. So that's kind of a discrete answer to one of those questions. And then I'll put in this other link to a lot of reports that have been commissioned by by a Michigan group called the Watershed Council related to line 5. These reports are pretty interesting. And I'm sorry, Sandy, what was your other question about jobs?
Right. Well, in fact, that flows into another popped up here on the Q&A. It says 700 jobs proposed, but we don't have the number of workers in the region who would be qualified for the jobs. Most would be from unions and workers from other parts of Wisconsin or out of state. On line 3 in Minnesota, according to reports in Star Tribune, Enbridge was unable to meet the 50% Minnesota workers that was written into the permit.
Yeah, I mean, I think the line 3 example is really pertinent. I mean, one thing that I would be concerned about with respect to, the following through with this project, even if Michigan doesn't, allow the company to go through the Straits of Mackinac, this pipeline, if it's approved, and this new route, if it's approved, could be used for long-term oil storage. So that may even be more dangerous than than transporting oil. So I mean, this is a very dangerous project, and there's a lot of providing a foreign company with the opportunity to do what it will. I mean, I think we've had experience with Enbridge, and certainly Minnesota has had experience with Enbridge not complying with environmental regulations because they will just pay a fine.
Right.
And it's, it's seen as the cost of doing business. So I think it's worthwhile to really highly scrutinize everything that the company puts forward, because oftentimes, these companies within these processes will just say whatever seems to be most expedient, and that may or may not be how they intend to use a project, or how they intend to use this piece of infrastructure that they're being provided.
I do recall a retired Wisconsin DNR man who was involved in the permitting of the Ladysmith mine years ago said none of the criteria that were laid out in the proposal were met, which is a revealing statement. There is a question being asked, and if one of our tech guys will answer it in the chat, or that would be helpful. They were being asked, will this recording be provided to the participants? Just a reminder as we conclude tonight that the DNR deadline is now March 18th, and the Corps of Army Engineers is March 7th. So please let your voice be heard. Again, thank you, Philomena, and thank you, Marcia. And as we close this evening, the Indigenous Peoples Allies Committee, our First Congregational United Church of Christ in Appleton, Wisconsin, wishes to announce its support of Native Justice Coalition's Resolution 2022-01. We join in dedication to authentic truth-telling, healing, and outgoing strategic reconciliation efforts that directly aid our resilient Native nations as they seek to heal from the lingering impacts of the Indian boarding schools. I thank you both, and good night.
Thank you so much. Please send in your comments.